just wanted to ask you if you could kind of set the scene for the relationship between empire and the British monarchy historically.
Well, first of all, actually, you probably should have a parasitologist on with me. That is to say, a scientist who studies parasites,
Right.
because this so called royal family has been feeding on the bodies of the host, people like myself, for example, for over centuries. Now, in order to understand the British Empire, you have to ask yourself, how was it that this minor empire, this minor nation on the fringes of Europe in the 1500s, by within a century was well on its way to building this mighty empire on which the sun never set? And it's a long story summarized in my book on the 16th century. But for the sake of our audience today, I'll say that the simple answer is that London basically did an end run around religious conflict. Recall that the major empires in the 1500s were the Catholic powers, Spanish and Portugal, and the Muslim power, speaking of the Ottoman Turks. And when Martin Luther arises with the Protestant sect in 1517, Britain, or excuse me, I should say England, signs on. And what happens is that unleashes a tidal wave of religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics. England basically decides to improvise, and it migrates to race as a concept. That it allows it, number one, to incorporate under its flag many who it had been warring with. Speaking of the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, all sort of recalculated as being white. And at the same time, it designated those not so inducted into those hallowed halls of whiteness as being inferior, subject to being plucked, subject to being enslaved. In fact, Andrew Young, who you may recall was the former mayor of Atlanta, former United States ambassador to the United Nations, he argued that London basically invented racism. Now, that may be a bridge too far, but it does speak to the fact about how the British Empire was basically built upon conceptions of race and racism, which extended well into the 20th century. For example, if you look at their colony, Hong Kong, turned over to China circa 1997, you may recall that the racial divide there was between those of, quote, and if you go into the British archives in Kew Garden, type this in and you'll come up with hundreds of files, or if not thousands, those of pure European descent, which was their definition of whiteness, and everybody else, which was basically the Chinese, who were made to be second-class citizens in their own homeland. And this has had a very noxious impact upon politics. I think it helped to sideline just struggles in Scotland and in Ireland, because, as you know, many in Scotland and Ireland, when they crossed the Atlantic, they were rebranded as white and therefore were able to participate in the colonial feasts in the Caribbean and in North America. And it's striking that when the British Empire goes into eclipse in the 20th century, you begin, as you do see today, to see Scottish nationalism rise. Now Scotland wants to be independent. I dare say that because of the ham-fisted policies of this man referred to as King Charles III, that Scottish independence will happen sooner rather than later. And I haven't even touched upon the anti-democracy of it all. I recall the former South African president, Thabo Mbeki, reprimanded the British foreign minister after the foreign minister had castigated certain African leaders for not leaving office. And he said, in your country, the head of state power is transmitted just genetically. I mean, here you had this woman that just served for 7 decades, given the fact that these billionaires are trying to find the cure, if you like, to death. He may serve under the president's rules forever. So this is just an outrage. And as I said, you really need a parasitologist on to explain what's been happening in the UK in recent decades.
And what are some of the things that happened under the Queen's watch? I mean, to the extent that, and this isn't about her as a personality, but just so people understand, I think not everyone knows what kind of atrocious historical episodes there have been more recently. People think of, okay, slavery ended and that was it. But can you talk about the recent kind of neo-colonial horrific oppressions, killings, massacres that happened?
Well, first of all, massacres. I'm sure many in your audience are familiar with what happened in British India approximately a century ago with the Amritsar massacre. Some may be familiar with what happened in Bengal during World War II, when Britain basically engineered a famine that killed tens of thousands, if not millions. A decade later, in 1953, you saw Her Majesty's Armed Forces intervene in Guyana on the northern coast of South America to dislodge the left-leaning leader, Chetty Jagan, and then stir up, to this very day, antagonisms between the Guyanese of African descent, the Guyanese of Indian descent. I'm sure your audience is familiar with what happened contemporaneously with the overthrow of Chetty Jagan's regime. That is to say, the suppression of the revolt in Kenya, the so-called Mau Mau revolt, where folks were tortured, folks were castrated. Reparations of a sort have been approved as a result of righteous struggle by the Kenyan people. But let me recommend a movie. I don't know if you've seen Sean Penn's movie, The Falcon and the Snowman. I recommend it highly. It talks about how Britain, or Her Majesty, if you like, being this so-called figurehead ruler in places like Australia, that London can manipulate the Governor General, who is the Crown's representative in Canberra, in Australia, to dislodge a government, which happened in 1975 with the Gough Whitlam government, a Labour Party government in Australia, leaning left, anti-Australian participation in the U.S. genocidal war in Vietnam. Something similar happened in Grenada in 1983 when the U.S. forces under Ronald Wilson Reagan intervened at the behest of the Governor General, Her Majesty's representative. And so I could go on in this vein, but this sort of celebration of this family, which has been an embodiment of white supremacy. And in fact, you see it, the so-called King Charles III, recall that his father was of Greek origin, for example, which means that he's half Greek. And it's that sort of intermarriage of these royal families over the decades and centuries that has helped to consolidate a certain kind of pan-European rule, which is really just a neo version of white supremacy.